So, raise your hand if you have ever seen a movie that's about the Exodus story.
Yeah.
Most of us, right, have seen some sort of a movie or another, whether it's something like the Ten Commandments or one of the ones that came out in the 80s, like the one that was about Prince of Egypt, that was by, I think that was Steven Spielberg. Anyway, there's lots of choices out there. So, for those of you who have seen one of those movies, who was the hero of the story? Moses, that's right. Usually Moses is the one that's portrayed as the hero of the story. So, what about God? What's God's role in those pictures? Does anyone characterize it? Like, I mean, what's his character portrayed like, or what's he seen as if God was a character in those movies?
A severe kind of authority figure.
Kind of an authority figure.
Hero.
Sorry?
Hero.
A hero. God is kind of portrayed as a hero also. Spreading the seas and stuff. Anything else? Powerful. That's right. Pretty omnipotent, powerful, almost like a hero in and of himself. Well, today's first reading finds Moses right at that dramatic moment in front of the burning bush. And I want to thank the Altar Guild for giving us a prop. If you're in our online community, we have a perfect bush right here in front of us. But Moses is standing there in front of his bush, and he's asking the same kind of question that we're asking through those movies, which is, who are you, God? What are you like? What's your character? The interesting thing is that Moses, at this point in the story, he's in hiding. He had to run away from Pharaoh and from his home and from his family that he had known his whole life. He had to run out into the wilderness of Midian and start a new life. He found a new family, he married, he'd had children, and he had built up a prosperous flock. He used to be this urban child of a royal Egyptian household, or adopted child in a royal Egyptian household, but now he's a simple desert herdsman. And the interesting thing is, maybe Moses at this point in the story is also sort of hiding from God. I mean, if you were Moses, you could see thinking in and of yourself, it might have partly been God that got me in trouble with my adopted Egyptian kin. I mean, yes, Moses is the one that made that impulsive act of righteous anger when he stopped the Hebrew slave from being whipped and beaten by his Egyptian overlord. But Moses was running away not only from Pharaoh's retribution, but probably even the types of demands that God reconnecting him with his own heritage might have been making on him. The thing is, there's no hiding from God. I mean, God even finds Moses right out there in the middle of the wilderness on top of this mountain. I mean, imagine if you're Moses and you think you're pretty safe because you feel like you have successfully escaped from your past and its misdeeds, and suddenly, there you are, confronted by a voice coming out of a mysteriously burning bush. And that voice is claiming to be God. And not only that, but that voice is telling you that you have to go back to the very place that you thought you had escaped from. I mean, it is no wonder that Moses' reaction is to want to turn away. He wants to not hear the voice that identifies itself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's almost sort of like, la, I'm not listening. Moses, the murderer on the run from one of the most powerful empires of his day, has discovered that there is still something that he cannot run from. God is probably the last being in the universe that he wants to encounter, and yet there God is. So Moses tries a different tack. He says, you have the wrong person for the job. I mean, couldn't you have picked someone else, God? I mean, can you blame him? I don't think going back to take God's people out of slavery feels like a safe bet for Moses. But God insists on calling Moses to be the one to return. And God assures Moses that he will not be alone in this awesome and frightening task that's been laid out before him. I will be with you, is what the voice from that bush says to Moses. Then Moses tries a different tack. Well, what should I say your name is? I imagine that what Moses is really asking is, who are you anyway, God? And why should I, or those people who have been enslaved for generations, trust you? And then God, because God's a genius, right? God gives a simple but incredibly complete, as well as enigmatic answer. I am who I am. I mean, does that clear up the question for you? Not really. I mean, it definitely doesn't dispel all of Moses' misgivings, because he goes right on to keep arguing with God and making excuses for several more chapters. But the other thing about it is that it is simple and elegant and wraps it all up. That huge question, who are you, God? God's answer to Moses and to us is, you already know who I am. You know how I have always been with you. You know what I always do for you. And you know how I will always relate to you. Because God is saying that we know God by God's actions towards us. How God has acted in history. How God has acted now in our own lives. And how God's never-failing presence, love, grace, and mercy will always be there for us and for all generations. You know me already, says God. Yet we, people, have not always found it easy to accept that kind of simple and open answer from God. We hear from Paul today in his letter to the church in Corinth that the people of the Exodus, well, they often went on, even after this point when Moses got the ironclad answer, to continue to forget who God was. Especially when they got wrapped up in the kinds of things that made them frightened or uncertain in this incredible journey that they were in with God across the wilderness. See, despite all of God's amazing, steadfast acts of salvation, I mean, all those cinematic moments, the parting of the Red Sea and the tablets coming down from on the mountain, despite all of that, God's people still had times when they turned to things like hedonism and idols for a better answer to their problems. These ancient Israelites, like some people in the church in Corinth that Paul's talking to, are seeking the most powerful guarantee that they can find against whatever misfortune they see looming on the horizon or maybe already plaguing them. And I mean, are we any different today? In our hearts, I think that we all want to know what else that we can be doing to assure ourselves of the very best protection we can find from our current day threats. As we grasp for this security, we so often forget that we already know that God is steadfast, that God is present, that God is the one who saves. And that's Paul's answer to his audience too. You do know God. You know this God who is the God of your ancestors, the same God that you all have met in the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, Paul is saying, don't forget who God is and always will be. God's never failing love was there then, just as it is with you right here now in this church in Corinth. See, maybe part of what sin is, what human sin is the act of forgetting who God is. Because we do that, we forget how God loves us. I mean, why else would we fall into doing things our way instead of God's way, even when we've learned what God's way is? Why would we do things that are hurtful instead of healing? The crowd questioning Jesus in today's gospel, well, they're looking for that same kind of assurance in the face of being called by Jesus into urgent repentance. They want to know things like, can we assume that we're going to be safe just because we haven't been punished? That must mean that we're the ones being favored. Can we take other people's misfortunes and our lack of it as some sort of evidence that we, in fact, are not sinners and it's those people over there who are? And an even bigger question, does our prosperity signal that we've gotten it right in God's eyes? Now, that crowd is bringing as evidence to Jesus a tragic and brutal example of human violence. It's a typical news headline that we might even see today. Tyrant ruler slaughters worshipers in prayer in their temple, bath of human blood mixed with their offerings. We've all heard it, haven't we? And in response, Jesus mentions another headline hauntingly familiar to us. Tower toppled by zealots, terrorists, hundreds killed. Jesus is challenging that crowd gathered before him. He's saying to them, if you think that people who have suffered in these kinds of tragedies deserve that kind of horrible death any more than you or I, then you are wrong. See, they've forgotten who God is. They think that catastrophic disaster is evidence of God's wrath against sinfulness. And their misconception, it persists in all human communities even today. I mean, we've heard those claims that this disease or that disaster is somehow a deserved punishment. Jesus is arguing that that kind of logic is absolutely wrong. He says that God does not work this way. Jesus reminds his audience that they're all sinners, and they should not put themselves sanctimoniously above others. And then Jesus takes the focus off of the people themselves and off of the other people that they're trying to compare themselves with, and puts that focus back on God. How God's grace and mercy manifests in this ever-patient call to us to turn to God and seek God's love again. Jesus wants to show them that they too can and do know God by how God relates to us. So, Jesus gives us this wonderful story. It's the story of a gardener unwilling to give up on a fruitless fig tree. He's refusing to cut it down, and instead God nurtures, just like God is the one who nurtures us, giving water and fertilizer and bringing forth fruit. Now, I've come clean with you all before this that I personally am not much of a gardener. And I know there's a lot of really amazing gardeners in this congregation. So we have these huge citrus trees in our backyard that we inherited. They've been in our, I think they must be at least 60 or 70 years old. They look like they've been there a long time, and they're very tall and prolific. And they do generally put forth a lot of fruit. But about a year after I moved into our home, so 20-something-ish years ago, I noticed that the leaves of our orange tree were turning yellow, and the fruit didn't look nearly as plump and ripe and taste as sweet as it did that year that we moved in the late spring, and it had been nurtured by the previous owner, who was an excellent gardener. So I asked my pruner, and my pruner told me that I needed to reinforce the watering basin that was around it so that it included all of the root of the tree, and then give it some gentle soaking so that it had enough water, and then to feed it with citrus food and extra iron several times a year. And of course, my orange tree improved. But the funny thing is, it still will struggle if it doesn't get that kind of proper attention every year. It has continued to need this kind of TLC. It wasn't just a one and done kind of project. And I'm a really uneven gardener, so if I fall off watering it or forget to feed it one season, it really shows. My orange tree, well, it'll always need that kind of nurturing and water and feeding. Now, I know that in Jesus' story, the landowner only gives the gardener another season to nurture the fruit in that fig tree, to make it put forth. But the thing is that I also know who God is. And I know that God is the God who never gives up on me as long as I am here on this earth. And you know what? I think people, we're not that different from my orange tree. We need ongoing nurture year after year in order to continue bringing forth fruit. And we kind of go in waves, because sometimes our branches are heavily laden with produce. Maybe it's been a great year in terms of not too much drought, not too much cold, because orange trees, they kind of need that perfect middle spot. But other times we fall back to looking yellow or withered. And sometimes we're in one of those times or places in our life where we're producing what would be considered a sparse crop. The great thing is that through all of this, God is always exactly who God is. God's never failing love is just right there with us, bringing to us the nurture and the love that we need to come to the place where we'll bear fruit again. God did this for our ancestors. God does it in our own lives, and God will be doing it for our children and our children's children and our children's children's children. We may forget this, and we may turn and try to find our own security in ways that distort who God is and who God is for everyone. We may even try to hide from God when God is right there calling us home. But God never forgets, and God is always the God who is who God is. Through all of our seasons of good yield and of barren years, God continues to dig a trench so that we can soak in the good water. God continues to give us fertilizer, and God continues to nurture in us the new fruit. I want to close today with what may be a very familiar poem to all of you by George Herbert. It's his attempt to understand who God is, no matter how hard that is for him to accept in his own life. This is Love Bade Me Welcome. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first endurance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. Aghast, I answered, woe thee to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then, I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit.